So greetings, those of you who may have signed on a couple minutes early. We're waiting for folks to sit here. We'll probably end up going around 10:05, between 10:05 and 10:10. So we're just on the call waiting, chit-chatting. I'm in my remote offices at temporary global headquarters of Tech San Diego in beautiful Rancho Penasquitos, where I've been working remotely for the past few months. You know, it's funny, one of the things I've been talking to people is making sure your home office is set up. And my house has an office, but my spouse has ended up commandeering the other office. So I'm in a temporary office in another room that's not an office room. And one of the things I did is I actually got some PVC and I put a curtain up, and I have a nice backdrop that I was able to use my my MacGyver skills and put some PVC up and a blue curtain, and that's worked out nice because I don't have to worry about what's behind me or what's going on. It makes it look nice. And of course, I've also had to worry about the Wi-Fi in the house, and ended up getting a new Wi-Fi system. Bought that mesh Orbi system with a couple different satellites, which works really well. It's amazing how a better Wi-Fi system really works, and the ones that's supplied by your provider are usually not top of the line. So, you know, it's worth it, the extra investment. Just preparing for our webinar, waiting for folks to come on. We're gonna wait till 10:05, 10:10 or so. See if we get a nice critical mass here. So we're just waiting. Hope everyone is staying safe and productive. We had a stand-up COVID meeting this morning, and one of the things we talked about was productivity, working from home. And while everyone seems to be doing okay, I provided a counterpoint that I think there's going to be some issues coming up with working remotely. And one of them is, you know, how do you maintain your culture? So we'll see how companies respond to that. I think, Brooke, you're still on, right?
Hey, Kevin, still here?
All right, just
watching the attendees rise, and you just let me know when you want to get started.
All right, sounds good. Just making sure you're still there. Trying to fill in the dead space here. We had a CEO roundtable. They have a spinoff. They call it a stand-up COVID-19, so they could just talk about those issues. And we had a meeting this morning that was interesting. And one of the things that most people agreed is a lot of the companies that they're returning very slowly to the workplace. So it's just interesting to see how other companies are handling those issues. And even some of the larger companies in town, there's like no date, you know, and some of them are saying they may not be returning to their workplace until there's a vaccine, which was a little shocking.
You know, it's shocking, Kevin, but it's also probably smart, given that we're seeing rise in cases and people have concerns. And, you know, for workers out there that have children, that we don't know what the school plan is going to look like, and it really varies from district to district. So I get it.
And that's a recurring theme on the daycare. I mean, I've talked to a number of companies that, you know, have had to give some extra allowances for working parents. And there's still not a lot of summer camps and not a lot of places to send kids, especially the K through 12.
Yeah, that's a hard age, and also for the parents that have the really small children, maybe their home childcare provider isn't comfortable coming back to work, right? And so they're having to rely on family and friends, and it just presents a lot of challenges.
That it does.
This is the time where you want to be dual income, no kids, right?
Yeah. I have a 17-year-old that just graduated from high school, and trying to find her a summer job before she goes off to college is proving to be a little more challenging than we had thought.
Yeah, absolutely.
So one of the other things we touched upon is the unemployment rate for tech. And I was telling people I testified in front of the Sandag Board of Governors, which are a regional planning body, and they asked me, I'm not an economist, but they asked me to guess what the unemployment rate was. And based on talent polls and talking to companies, I told them it was, below 5%. And they were really shocked to hear that. And, I know a lot of companies that are hiring. And, at least in the tech space, I mean, certainly there's been some reductions, but for a lot of companies, they're actually looking at, they suspended adding people. Now they're starting to think about talent acquisition again. And, I think a lot of them are being shocked that they thought they'd return to the marketplace for talent and, everyone be banging down their doors. And that's simply not the case.
No, there are a lot of people that are hesitant to jump back into the workforce. So talent acquisition is difficult, more so than you'd think right
now. It's 10:03, so we're going to wait a couple of more minutes and then we'll get started. For those of you who can hear, welcome. We're going to start our webinar in just a couple of minutes. We'll let some stragglers come in, but we won't penalize the rest of you for being early. So we'll start in a couple of minutes. Hope everyone is safe and being productive. While we're doing this, go ahead and use the chat, use the questions, and I'll be monitoring those questions along with Sarah Spiva, our marketing and events manager. And if we feel like we need to interrupt, we will. We typically don't, but we'll try to get to those questions at the end of the webinar. We'll ask those questions. And this will also be archived and it'll be on YouTube as well. I'll reintroduce myself and then we'll make sure to introduce our speaker here in a couple of minutes. For those of you tracking the virus spread here, I'm sure you know, but I go to the County of San Diego website quite often, and even in San Diego, we've seen a pretty big spike. But I always look at the hospitalizations as well, and I think the county has done a really good job. Just Google San Diego County, and it'll get you on the way they relay the statistics. One of the first graphs you see is new cases versus testing. And it gives you a really quick glimpse of what's going on in the county. And past couple of days has not been good, but you can't take a couple of days. We have to look at a 5 to 7 day trend. So pretty soon we'll be able to see what that looks like. All right, let's go ahead and we'll start getting started. And those of us that joined late can join us. My name's Kevin Carroll. I'm the Executive Director for Tech San Diego. We've done a series of pandemic-related podcasts and webinars and information for our members to get a grip. And the impetus for this particular webinar, and I'll introduce Brooke in a second, is talking to my friends at Procopio and just relaying that, people are returning to the office. This happened obviously after Memorial Day, And at least those that are returning, it's obviously a lot of people are still working remotely, and there's issues surrounding that. But just kind of doing a checkup about where we are, what are some of the ramifications, what are some of the liabilities, what is Brooke seeing in the marketplace. You know, he's really at the front end of a lot of these liability issues. So this is going to be a great topic. So let's get started. I'm going to introduce Brooke. Brooke is I never know whether it's a lawyer or attorney at Procopio. He represents employers in all aspects of labor and employment litigation, including claims for improper wage deductions, failure to pay wages, failure to pay overtime wages, failure to provide meal periods, misclassification of employees, inaccurate wage statements, commission calculations, private attorney general act claims, class actions, discriminatory employment actions. So all of those very scary things that you worry about, Brooke is right in the middle of them. He's been recognized as I'm going to put this in quotation, a super lawyer in San Diego, in employment litigation and business litigation categories. And so with that, Brooke, if I missed anything on your bio, please feel free to fill in those gaps. I'm going to turn it over to Brooke. Brooke, thanks for coming on this morning, and thanks for doing this webinar.
All right, Kevin, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for attending. A couple quick things. Make sure that if you can't see the PowerPoint presentation, that you let Sarah know in the chat box. Make sure that you're set up okay. Also, you know, we're going to cover a lot of topics. Some of them may be applicable to you, some of them may not. Hopefully we can get through it quickly so I can answer your direct questions and how that impacts you on a day-to-day basis. I want you to understand what the black letter law and ordinances are that businesses are having to face, but we all know that if it was that easy to follow, you know, the gray areas are what get us in trouble. And so that's what we're going to talk about, really try to shift away from what you have to do and really focus on how do you implement it and what resources are out there for you to look at and who should you talk to when you have a question. So again, thanks for returning. I want to talk to you a little bit about the agenda. There's a new statement out there called the Resilience Roadmap by Governor Newsom. Love him or hate him, he's the guy calling the shots right now. On a local level, we have the San Diego Return to Work protocols, okay? And there's going to be some documentation. We'll talk about what that means. Some of you, especially in the tech industry, are facing challenges with getting your workforce to come back to work. For lower wage earners, they quite frankly, at least through the end of the month, may be earning more money on unemployment than actual working. And then for high wage earners, there's all sorts of issues, medical issues, childcare issues, culture issues, which Kevin alluded to before the call. We'll also talk about workers' compensation, how that's a mixed bag. It's good for you. It's also bad for you. We'll talk about reasonable accommodations and what that means in light of COVID, and then some of the litigation that we're seeing. So let's talk first about the Resilience Roadmap. There's two links in here. Just, you know, we're going to send the PDF out after the call today to all the attendees. You know, keep this, use it as a guideline for checking where we are. We're right now in what's called an early stage 2 in California. Now, San Diego has been granted a variance that was petitioned for by our county officials, and we're in an advanced stage. So that's why you're seeing that we have dine-in restaurants reopening. You know, they're putting spacing out. You'll see that they have to follow the template. We've actually have in-store retail here in San Diego County. That's not statewide, but a lot of the things that for in the tech industry, you know, arguably, some of you may have been part of the critical infrastructure, and maybe you've been open the entire time. Maybe you've been working the entire time. But the reason I bring up the Resilience Roadmap is because these things change, and unfortunately, it's not one directional. We can actually, Governor Newsom yesterday threatened that we may be going back into isolation and more of a quarantine type model, which would stall our road down this roadmap. So the San Diego County Safe Reopening Plan, for the listeners today that work in San Diego, it's really important. And Kevin and I were talking about this earlier. I'm going to show you what the actual reopening plan looks like on the next slide. But the most important thing that people don't realize is that teleworking and telecommuting is still the preferred method of work. If you do not have to be in the office, you certainly should give some thought to why do you have to have people in the office. If they can work from home, let them do that. If they do come into the office, you've got to perform temperature checks. Anyone over 100 degrees needs to be excluded. There needs to be facial coverings or masks in the workplace when your employees and staff interact with each other. So basically, if they're within 6 feet of each other, you've got to put the mask on. You saw recently, earlier this week, that Governor Newsom said this is really a statewide issue, and there was a lot of questions. Well, what does that mean? Do I have to wear a mask everywhere? Well, it's very similar to the San Diego reopening plan, which is if you are within 6 feet of people, you need to have a mask on. There's a requirement that lunchrooms, break rooms, bathrooms need to be disinfected with actually EPA and CDC approved cleaners on a more frequent basis. Some industries, likely not tech, have to have PPE, but again, face coverings falls into that. So if you're going to mandate that your employees have it, you can certainly say cloth face coverings are fine, but you should have a backup plan. You should have some extra supplies at work so employees who show up without face coverings can perform their job. There are signs that are required. You have to show unilateral flow throughout or one-directional flow throughout the building. We have that here at Procopio, and I'm actually in the Del Mar office today, and I guess I'm a rebel with a cause, so sometimes I go against the arrows just because no one's here but me, and I feel like I'm doing something rebellious. But obviously, if there are more people here today, we have to follow the flow. There needs to be 6-foot separation markings. So in any common area, we need to, rope off chairs. We need to provide distancing, remove tables, etc. What that means for the tech industry is that the common open space where a lot of people work, around conference tables, that needs to be limited, and there needs to be proper separation between the tables. You can see this plan at this link here, and A and B, there's A, B, C, and D segments, but A and B are actually required for all businesses, all right? And you can see what that looks like. We talked about some of those issues, but you have to fill this plan out and you have to post it. So make sure that when you return to work, this is properly posted. It's also a good idea to circulate a signed copy to your employees so they understand what their expectations. And if you take away one thing from today's webinar, it's this. Clear communication to your employees about what is expected is going to save you a lot of headache. We're already getting the questions. Well, what if I don't want to wear a mask? Or I have an employee who refuses to wear a mask. Have a policy in place and then make people adhere to the policy. Okay. Let's talk about what, return to work protocols mean. Right now in the stage 2 or the advanced stage 2 for San Diego workers, we're still limited to critical infrastructure. So there's a federal agency out there that you didn't know exists called CISA, and they decide who is a critical infrastructure. And then it also applies to businesses and networks that support critical infrastructure. So again, taking Procopio as an example, if the construction industry is a critical infrastructure industry, and we have attorneys, we have an entire construction team, arguably they could be in the office right now because they're part of the critical infrastructure. All right. As this reopening plan moves forward, you're going to see movie theaters, gyms, all of those things start to open. So as in the tech industry, depending on what you do, your business may actually provide support to those critical infrastructures. So understand, work with counsel, whether or not to decide if you are part of that critical infrastructure. And if you're not, you need to make sure that you're still following the protocols, such as working from home. Again, use remote work when possible. Stagger schedules. So right now, you can have 3 different groups of people. So imagine you have 30 employees. You assign 10 of them to different groups. The A group works on Mondays and Wednesdays. The B group works Tuesdays and Thursdays. The C groups works Fridays, and then you rotate that schedule around so everyone's getting equal opportunity to come into the office place if that's necessary. We talked about the floor planning and testing and screening. We're going to cover a little bit about the do's and don'ts. I think all of you, just from following the news, you know what's open: grocery stores, pharmacies, banks, and then you have seen what is starting to open, which is, sit-in diners, sit-in restaurants, and we're going to see some more guidance towards gyms and fitness centers. If you have little ones that play sports, you know that Kristen Gaspar in our county has done a great job in petitioning Sacramento to let San Diego reopen sports, and now sport camps are open. So hopefully there's some moms and dads on the phone calls right now thinking, how can I get my little ones back into camps, because they're driving me bananas at home, and I'm one of those people. In fact, 2 of my boys have been in baseball camp all week, and they are at home today, so I'm sure my wife is pulling her hair out. So, again, we talked about maximizing telework, but what about workers that have legitimate medical concerns? You have workers who are over 65, perhaps they're immunocompromised. They want to remain at home because the doctor said it would be a good idea. You have workers that have children that don't have childcare, can't afford certain camps. Maybe they're doing a different trimester school system. If any of you have kids and you haven't looked at the horrible options that are out there for the fall, please do that. You can go to the superintendent website, Sacramento. They've proposed 4 options for school districts to adopt. As a Carlsbad resident, I know they're still mulling that over. Encinitas has sent out guidance last 2 weeks, I believe, about what they intend to do, and you could elect one of the options. But it's not going to be great, folks. You're not going to have complete coverage like you did previously. So talk to your staff about this now. Get ahead of the curve. What does it look like for parents that both work or single parents that work and they need childcare issues? Are you going to allow them to remote work? And if so, consider a remote work agreement. If you communicate the expectations on the front end about, I need you to do these tasks and these assignments, we're going to reimburse you for these expenses, there's not going to be these gotcha moments. You're not going to have unhappy employees saying, I went through 3 reams of computer paper because you asked me to, print up the budget a bunch of times, and now I want to be reimbursed for this. So think about that stuff now with your counsel. Create these remote work agreements. What happens when you have the employee that says, well, at work, I had an ergonomic chair, but at home, I'm sitting on my Bosu ball and now I have back problems, okay? These are the types of stuff that we're already starting to see, and clients are having to address that. And I think that if you get ahead of that by doing the remote work agreements and really talking about what's expected when you do work from home, you're in a much, much better spot. All right, return to work documentation. So some clients, and this is certainly a consideration we should discuss, you may or may not have applied for some federal relief. There's obviously economic injury disaster loans. There's the PPP through the CARES Act. There's different tax credits you can get through FFCRA, and we'll talk about those. But there's also practical things. Figure out who in your workforce is essential versus non-essential. And what I mean by that is we all know that in the workforce, regardless of what your job is, there's people that we absolutely have to have because we can't run a business. And then there's support staff, administrative staff, and others who we could consider reducing their hours. Obviously, we need to do that on a prospective basis. We need to give them proper notice, and we need to make sure that it's financially justified. Okay, so if there ever is a claim, we've actually done the homework on the front end to show why we need to reduce the staff or reduce these hours. We've talked about temperature checks and screenings, staggered work schedules. There's also, we're going to get to this, but there's also new safety policies that are required. So some of that is in your IIPP or your injury illness prevention plan. If you are in the medical field, if that's where your tech is started, you may actually have to have aerosol transmittable disease update because of COVID. Again, those are things that you should work with your counsel on. But the other question we get frequently is, Well, we just want to make sure all of our employees are COVID-free, so we're going to require that they all go get tested. Well, that's great. But guess what? That test is good for the minute that you read it, or maybe not even. It's really good for the minute you take it. Because by the time that you've actually received your results, that employee could have been out there and already been exposed to COVID. And I think that's what we're all starting to learn, is that the medical professionals wrestle with this. What does an antibody test mean? Well, it means that you have antibodies in your system, but we don't know how long those antibodies are good for. We do not know specifically if you can re-get or be reinfected with the different strands of COVID-19. So if you're going to require testing, understand as an employer, you're on the hook for that. I think a more practical guidance, and this is why I like the San Diego reopening plan. I've even used it for our clients in Orange County because theirs is maybe less cumbersome, but it isn't as prophylactic. And what I mean by that is, if you're temperature checking every day for the employees coming into the office, you're doing a pretty good job of making sure that you have healthy employees in the workforce. If an employee says, I don't want to come to work today, I don't feel good, let them do that. Now is not the time to be draconian and say, no, we need a doctor's note. If any of you have actually tried to get into a doctor's office right now, it's incredibly hard. And many of the different medical providers are actually segregating their offices. So there's sick offices and healthy offices, and that becomes burdensome. So before we may say, give an employee, 10 to 15 days to get a medical note, now I think we need to rethink that and really be reasonable. All right. I want to talk about some of the nuances of testing and screening and what we're seeing employers face with. The first is, as an employer or any business, you're subject to laws that you may not even know exist, okay? So one of them is the American Disabilities Act, the ADA. There's FEHA, which is ADA is a federal law, okay? There's FEHA, which is a state law. That's what you typically see discrimination and harassment claims. There's the California Medical Information Act, and there's the California Consumer Privacy Act. And just by recording data and keeping that data, you could potentially be in violation of these laws if that data is shared inappropriately or made public, even accidentally. We all remember years ago when Target got in trouble, right? Well, not only Target, but other companies that leaked consumer data really started the wave for the California Consumer Protection Act. And it applies to certain businesses, but most importantly, it means that if you collect data on consumers, and in this case, employees do qualify, then you have to protect it. And if there is any sort of accidental release of that information, then you are held civilly liable. Now, I bring this up because an easy way to get around this is to simply do temperature checks and not require antibody tests, not to do the whole go get blood draw, we're going to pay for it. And while that's nice, we're still not really sure what it means. If you take a temperature check, don't put Brooke Barnes, 102, sent home. Just send them home and have human resources follow up. We don't need to create logs. You'll see guidance out there that says that you need to do that because if ever pushed back on whether or not you're following protocols, you want to have documentation. I disagree with that because, and we'll talk about it, there is some really good protection out there through workers' compensation. And, it's kind of a mixed bag, but at the end of the day, the easier thing to do is just to take the temperature. Most of you are already aware, you've already seen it if you've seen the touchless thermometers, okay? But there's also some challenges. If you've got non-exempt workforce, so that those are the men and women that are hourly employees and they're coming to work and you're telling them, we usually start at 8, but I want you there at 7:45 so we can check your temperature and you can get in the elevators, et cetera. That could be compensable time, okay? There's an argument that it's government mandated and it's not for the benefit of the employer. But again, I think that's a weak argument. And since it is required, or you're at least telling your employees to show up at a certain time, you should consider treating it as compensable time. If you don't, I'm going to tell you that you've got less than a coin flip shot of defending that case. So what that means is, communicate that on the front end. Tell them that we're going to adjust your time for the time it takes to get screened. Stagger your work shifts. We already talked about that, but this is a good example of how it makes sense. Don't have everyone showing up at 7:45 and waiting in the lobby, because then you're out of compliance with the 6-foot distancing, and it's going to take a lot more time. So think about that stuff on the front end. Consent forms, some clients like them. Especially if you're doing any sort of COVID testing, antibody, blood draws. Again, we talked about the privacy issues and the confidentiality issues. OSHA, so Cal OSHA follows federal OSHA on most things. And one of the things I really like, and there are links at the end that we're going to provide for you. And this is good for, yes.
Brooke, does it matter,
Yep.
just real quick, does it matter who does the test? If you have a nurse do it, if you do it yourself, is there a situation where you have someone that's unskilled that may be doing the test wrong? Is there any liability associated with, geez, I was a higher temperature and this person didn't know how to use the temperature thing, and now we got everyone sick and it's their fault? Does it matter who does it?
Yeah, it's a great question, Kevin. And so I'm going to fast forward to the FAQs. I'm going to answer that.
I didn't know you were addressing that.
No, it's good. It's a great question. So we'll just fast forward there and we'll jump back. So that's one of the questions we get all the time is, can we perform the test? The answer is yes. You can train a staff member to do that. You can also hire a third-party staffing company to come in and send people to your work. You're not required to. You can imagine that business is booming. There are tons of workforce solution providers out there that will find you someone to literally sit at your entrance and screen people for you, okay? That is a pretty inexpensive option right now if you don't want to train someone, because back to Kevin's point, your training could be attacked. Was it sufficient? Was Bobby and Susie just kind of given the wink, wink, nudge, nudge, come on in, I'm not really, the batteries are dead today, don't worry about it. Those things do arise. The other one that we get a lot is, well, I just want Bobby and Susie to do it on their own and tell me that they're compliant. And that's really not compliant. So the safe reopening plan does say, or does allow, one interpretation is that you could have the employee self-screen in front of you, meaning they could actually hold the thermometer, right? They could be there in front of a supervisor, but you can't do it from home and just call in or text, hey, I'm 100%, okay? The other question we get is, well, in our industry, we come in and out of the workplace 20 times a day. Do I have to check their temperature 20 times a day? And it's no, just upon arrival. All right. And the other question we always get is, do I really have to wear a face covering when I'm in my office? I shut my door. I don't talk to anyone. I live a life of self-quarantine. I'm a lonely person, right? We get that one a lot. So the answer is, if you're within 6 feet of anyone, regardless of where you are in the office place, you need to have a mask. So just keep it with you. If you're in your office and the door is shut, no, you don't need to have it on, but you should have it nearby in case someone barges in unexpectedly and wants to go over an issue with you. You just put on your mask, all right? I understand, folks, in real life, that can be hard to enforce, but the way you do that, the way you get towards compliance is you require that everyone have a mask or a face covering with them when they go to work. So hopefully that answers some of those issues. But I do want to go back to the PPE, because this is actually a really helpful slide for people in tech, because if you are entering medical workplaces, hazmat workplaces, maybe you're designing an app, software, or technology that's being implemented. So you have field staff that are going out there. They're not going to the Procopios of the world where it's just a big office space. If they're actually entering into dangerous or hazmat areas, there are different levels of PPE that you are required to provide, okay? So they have 4 levels, very high, medium, and low risk. So make sure you know what your workforce is doing. And if they are, for example, you're providing stuff in the healthcare industry, mortgage industry is one of them. They're in the very high risk category, so that you may actually have to provide gloves and protective outfits as opposed to most people just have to provide face coverings. So again, we'll have the links. There's a link page in this presentation. Just check it. Make sure that you know where your workforce is going. We can get through some of this stuff. We've covered a lot of it. I mentioned the ATD plan. Just briefly hit it. If you are in those facilities, long-term care facilities, medical outreach services, outpatient clinics, nursing clinics, senior care facilities, labs, any of sort of public health services, including, the people that deal with animals, like animal control. If you're designing any of that stuff for these people and you're working with them, you need an ATD plan. And what that means is that you have to have a plan for your workforce so they know, if I'm exposed to these things, what do I do? And that's part of the update that's required. So this is a new guidance, and this is a new requirement by Cal OSHA to update your ATD plan and to update your IIPP, so your injury illness prevention program. There's some good templates and forms. I'm not encouraging any of you to go out there and spend $10,000 with Procopio or some other law firm to just create this out of the blue. A lot of this work has already been done by the CDC, so this isn't heavy lifting. I certainly encourage you to review it with counsel to make sure it makes sense, but you can get this stuff out there, and we have links for you to start looking at that. All right, this is a good slide here that talks about all of the overlapping guidance. Quite frankly, it's a little bit of a quagmire and a legal nightmare for companies to figure out what trumps what. I had a client say a few weeks ago, we've discussed it internally, and after the board meeting, we've decided we're not going to follow the San Diego reopening plan because we believe the Cal OSHA guidance trumps that because it's a state regulation, which is incorrect. Okay, so you have to follow everything from the federal, state, county, and even if it got local specific, like in school districts. So it is inclusive. It's not exclusive. So it's not an or situation. It's an and situation. So make sure your industry and your business is staying on top of it. Why does it matter what the agencies say? Can't I just pick one and do my best? Well, what we've decided is that if you can provide a consistent directive to your employee, and I mentioned this earlier, clear communication, frequent communication, and a policy, they are much more likely to follow it. And when you have that written resource that they can follow, unlike a handbook, which I always hear in depositions, the employee says, I never read it, it's 100 pages long. Make it simple. Give them a nice email with just a couple pages. Hey, this is what we're doing, folks, when you return to work. This is, and here's the resources. And then give them a contact, be it human resources, a CFO, a C-suite level, a specific manager. Give them a name. If you have questions, talk to this person. But probably the most important thing I can say is that we've already seen a huge uptick in lawsuits, all right? And one of the best defenses is we followed this guidance, we created this policy, and we followed it. A good faith belief in implementing a policy and following it is a great defense. Yes, accidents are going to happen. Yes, there's going to be anomalies out there, but it's still a great defense. And when we have employers that say, yeah, I heard about that, but we didn't want to do that. It seemed expensive. I don't know. We didn't spend the time and money to talk to HR or legal about it. They're in a bad spot. I certainly don't put that in emails, which unfortunately I've seen in the past. So that's why it matters. Okay, that's the black and white stuff. I know that was kind of long and lengthy. Let's get to what are you facing right now? Well, we know that there are a lot of employees that are still out of work right now. And whether it's because you put them on furlough or it's because they are sick or they're dealing with medical issues, there's a lot of return to work nuts and bolts that employers are facing. I know most of you know this, but I still want you to understand what it is. FFCRA or FFCRA, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, this provides two weapons or two resources that you can give to your employees, okay? COVID-PSL and FMLA. COVID-PSL is up to 80 hours. It's 100% of their pay for any COVID reason, including illness or state or local federal quarantine, okay? And you get 100% of your pay. That's capped at a little over $5,000, $5,110. Now, you can get 2/3 of your pay for caring for another employee. We actually have a FFCRA form that Procopio has developed. If you need that, just reach out afterwards. You'll have my contact information. We can provide that to you. We've been providing it to all of our clients and non-clients. It's helpful. It's good to document why someone is out and they need COVID-PSL. Why? Because you get a tax credit. You actually get to go and apply in your current payroll or your quarterly payroll for the amount of money you've paid. And this is good through the end of the year. So take advantage of this. The other is FMLA. It's up to 12 weeks. All right. And it is essentially capped at $10,000, 2/3 pay. And there's a 2-week waiting period. So I think there's a nifty slide here. Let me get to it. Yeah. So you can see how they interplay with each other. COVID-PSL, you can use for 2 weeks. FMLA, you can use for the remainder. It provides a lot of coverage. Now, there are some nuances, so be careful how you implement this. You need to be careful about what documentation you ask from the employees. This is not your typical go get a doctor's note situation. So work with counsel, work with HR, so you have good communications. A good rule of thumb is now's not the time to be frustrated. If you feel like you're getting taken advantage of, document your communications with employees in writing. And make sure you do it with the idea that it one day could be an exhibit to a lawsuit. Make sure you're reasonable. Make sure that you sound empathetic. Even if you have to fake it till you make it, make sure that you sound reasonable. I haven't seen a lot of people taking advantage of this federal program. I'm surprised, actually, that more employers are not telling their employees about it. So just be aware of it. Okay, so what happens if that isn't available to you? Either you don't qualify for FFCRA or you've got a employee that is already exhausted this, right? So I've used, actually, it looks like a question just came in. What options do you have to offer other than FMLA has been fully utilized? And that's a good question because this may have been authorized or utilized, or they may have already qualified for another FMLA issue and they've exhausted their leave. So you've got your regular paid sick leave under state and San Diego, right? And then you've got unpaid leave. Now, unpaid leave is tricky because it can't be punitive, and you need to make sure you communicate it properly to employees. So the way I like to do that, and here's a legal buzzword for you, reasonable accommodation. What does that mean? Well, give your staff and your employees an opportunity to communicate to you what is wrong and why they can't come to work. You know, I don't want to see the email from the employer that says, what, do you have a medical condition or something? What is it? I'd much rather you say, Dear Bob, Dear Susie, thank you for informing me you can't come to work today. Please let us know what you're dealing with and how we can assist with you with whatever your concern is. Please contact, give them a name, and talk to them directly about how we can get you back to work in a safe manner. Okay, that's what I'm talking about, being reasonable. Make sure that if you were presented that in a deposition and you've got opposing counsel on the other side of the room, you look at that and say, you know what, I'm proud of that. That actually sounds like I care. Now, hopefully you do care, but if you don't, please fake it till you make it, all right? We want to make sure that the employee self-identifies, and then we want to offer them the opportunity to go on unpaid leave, all right? And that means that they can take the time necessary. You want to communicate with them frequently about when they're going to return to work. And the common question that our team gets is, well, how long does this have to go on for? And unfortunately, there's not a bright line test. There are some good cases out there that talk about different time increments, but I still don't like to tell clients that because they get married to it. So for example, there's a case out there that says, 3 months of unpaid leave with no communication could be essentially reason for discharge. But those are those facts. And I don't want your company to be a new fact pattern and a new published case decision. So it really just depends. And look, if it's not hurting your pocketbook for them to be out on unpaid leave, then go ahead and consider that option. I think it's good. It certainly works well for elderly workers or even employees that are dealing with elderly parents, right? So what happens when they refuse to come back to work? I know that most people on the phone call are in tech and have different, inventions and platforms that they're pushing in the marketplace. But you may not be faced with this concern that we're seeing, like, for example, in the hospitality industry under the same way, because quite frankly, your workforce is probably pretty well educated. So they're not going to say, which I have literally seen in an email, I don't want to come back to work because I'm making more money on unemployment. If someone says that to you, you actually are required to report that to the EDD. That's unemployment fraud. And right now, there are a lot of people that are making more money on unemployment because of the additional $600 a week that they're getting from the federal government. So let's figure out what that means. Why do you not want to come to work, right? Is it a valid reason? Have you allowed the employees to communicate that reason? Have they exercised or do they qualify? Have they exercised and exhausted all of their COVID-related paid sick leave? Have you done enough to make sure the working conditions are safe? Have you communicated your safe reopening plan? And have you talked to your employees about the difference between taking some time off and job abandonment? So those are where policies are important. Now, what I like to say is determining what is a reasonable and unreasonable fear is not what Brooke thinks or what Kevin thinks or what Sarah thinks or any of the listeners on the call today. Determining what is reasonable versus unreasonable has to be subjective and objective. And what that means is that you and the employee may agree, but also does it objectively meet the standard? And that means if the employee says, Brooke, I don't want to come to work because you don't really have a safe reopening plan. And, when I did go back to work, no one was wearing masks, right? We all know that's going to sound objectively reasonable because we're required to have the plan. If they say, Brooke, I don't want to come work, something doesn't feel right. This is where your communication is key. Okay, tell me what's wrong. I don't know, it doesn't feel right. I heard you, I understand, but tell me specifically, what can we do to make sure that you feel safe coming back to work? And I know this feels like we're teasing this out and this is not how real people talk. And unfortunately, being a litigation attorney, I wish people did do this. Give your employees a chance to communicate their reasons. And when they put it in writing, then you can meet with your HR team or legal team to decide if it's reasonable or not and whether or not you have to accommodate it. I briefly just want to mention this off. If you have furloughed your employees, make sure you're giving them proper notice. Governor Newsom did suspend Cal Warren notice requirements, but we're still recommending that you work with counsel to have those similar notices because technically there's 2 DLSE opinion letters and a NASCO case that says anything longer than 10 days is a layoff. We don't think that that's really going to be challenged that much because of this is a pandemic, but just know the difference. And then obviously if you're laying people off, make sure you're ready to pay all of the accrued but unused PTO or vacation time. If you have questions about that, really make sure you have that dialed in because we have seen a few demand letters on not paying out PTO and vacation time when we put people on long furloughs, and then ultimately we decided we didn't need them and we laid them off. Okay, reasonable accommodation. We talked about what that means. Federal law, state law protects people with known or suspected disabilities. So you may have a worker that has asthma, heart conditions, diabetes, immune disorders. They don't feel comfortable coming to work. Now's not the time to say, tough, come to work, right? You're going to find yourself on the receiving end of an ADA case. We also get the other side. We have people that say, I can't wear a mask because I have asthma, right? What if you say, no, you have to wear a mask? Have you violated the ADA? I think there's a good argument that you have. If they have a medical condition, you can ask them to get a note from their physician that says, I can't wear a mask because I have this type of breathing difficulty. You may have to provide them accommodation. That means working from home or working away from people, because we have to balance both concerns, the individual employees issue with the ADA concern, as well as the general workforce who doesn't want to be exposed to them. So again, it's a bit of a balancing act. The key to this is invite your employees to communicate, engage in good faith, consider all of your options, go above and beyond what you previously would do. Don't adhere to very rigid policies. Executive Order 6220, what does this mean? Well, since May, they actually backdated it back to March, but it was signed in May. And so from March 19th to July 5th, and I got to tell you, I think this is going to get extended. I haven't seen it yet, but I just think there's going to be an extension here, given Newsom's stance on this. But basically, all COVID-related illness is presumed to be in the workforce if they return to work. Okay, so we have an obligation, give them the DWC1 form. All right, and here's kind of the criteria. They tested positive for COVID within 14 days after the day the employee came to work at the employer's direction. So not optional coming in or working from home. You have to require them to be there. It was on or after March 19th. It was not their house, so you don't qualify if you're working from home. And it has to be, the diagnosis has to be done by a licensed California physician. So your great grandma who does patchouli and herbs and sage and crystals, that's not good enough. You got to go to a licensed physician, right? And it has to be confirmed within 30 days of the date of diagnosis. So this is good and bad. It's great in the sense that now you can avoid civil liability because workers' compensation would be their only remedy if they got sick at work. Okay, so you're not going to have this extra lawsuit coming at you. It's bad because we all know that means that your workers' compensation rates are going up. They're likely going to skyrocket next year. So be ready for that. And that's why we say it's a little bit of a mixed bag. I want to get through this stuff quickly so I can certainly answer questions that you have. You obviously will have this presentation. You can refer to it. And if you have questions, you can reach out. Anticipated litigation. What do we see and what do we expect? So a lot of the same players, but just a little bit of a different twist. Wrongful termination. So retaliation for whistleblowing. You know, this is the employee that says you didn't temperature check the employees. The person that you did hire to do it was telling everyone that it didn't have batteries and it wasn't working, and I complained. And what did you do? You canned me. Well, you know what? It's always not black and white like that. The truth is, you may have been deciding you were going to term this employee for weeks because they were deemed non-essential and that they just didn't fit into your budgeting for these COVID times. Look, we all know it's thin to win right now. You've got to be lean and mean in your operation. So maybe you're already going through the layoff matrix with counsel or your HR to figure out who can provide the best services. But if that person raises a concern, you may want to think twice about retaliating against them, especially if you're not following the San Diego Safe Reopening Plan or any sort of guidance. Discrimination, harassment, these are going to be on the uptick for underlying disabilities. We talked about the asthma. We've talked about age, certainly race. This is disproportionately affecting certain races, so you got to be careful with that. We all know what's going on right now in this racial climate. So there any sort of comments or microaggression is a word. If you're not familiar with that, I encourage you to look at that up, microaggression. Any sort of messaging to employees needs to be sensitive right now. We also know that if you're not properly providing COVID-PSL or FMLA pay, there's actually a retaliatory prong there if you fire someone for taking it. Failure to provide reasonable accommodations, not engaging in the interactive process in good faith, not doing those communications properly, all right? We talked about warn notifications. This one is a little too specific to get into on a webinar, but talk to your attorney about if you are going to extend furloughs, what should be in there. There is some really good language that is required by the statute that if you provide and you extend over the 2-week furlough period, you're least protected. So make sure you're there and you're doing that if you're on furlough right now or expecting to go into furloughs when the PPP money runs out. And then also the wage and hour class actions, we've seen those. So these are all examples that have been filed since COVID started. We've seen class actions for injunctions, basically for employee misclassification because they want the benefits at the federal and state level. We've seen WARN Act cases filed for not properly providing sufficient notice. And we've also seen failure to pay sick leave properly and basically wage theft, as we call it, for not allowing employees to exercise their accrued PSL. So we have a question here. I want to read it to the group. If you have an employee who tests positive after returning to the physical workspace and you implement EPSL pay, do you still have to call it in as a WC case? So what I would say is if they're in that period, you want to give them the DWC1 form, okay? If they make the attestation or accusation that they picked it up in the workplace, don't fight it. It's going to be presumed to be valid if they meet all of those criteria. If they say, hey, I'm dealing with a sick kid and I had COVID, I want to exercise, or I think I may have COVID so I can go get tested. I want to exercise my sick leave. Let them stay home and do that. If that didn't answer your specific question and you're dealing with a specific situation, please feel free to contact me after the webinar. All right, practical tips and takeaways to wrap this up so we can have some more dialogue. I've said it once, I'll say it again. One thing, if you take away from this, is clear, concise, and regular communication, in writing preferably, to your workforce. Give them realistic return to work schedules. Start considering your operational needs for the rest of the year and into 2021 right now. Work on your safety reopening plan. Make sure that you have good documentation and be flexible. Like, this is not the time to be draconian and to have rigid policies. This is the time to be empathetic and go ahead and make the exception, communicate it in writing, and let them know that we're going to provide this for you, and we hope that you get better. And if you don't feel safe, let us know what we can do to make sure you are feeling safe coming back to work. Now, just yesterday, the federal government changed. I just want to mention this. It's not part of my slides. I haven't updated it since this just came out, but there is new SBA guidance on the recent extension of loan forgiveness in the CARES Act. So if you qualified and you received money, there's an option to extend to a 24-week payroll period instead of an 8-week period. There's some implications on what happens with that. And there's also kind of a new cap for owners of what they can pay themselves through this. So again, if you're unclear, I've updated the links in the website. I just didn't provide an actual slide. So you'll see the SBA guidance, the second bullet point down here. These are the new interim rules that we have from the Treasury Department. So familiarize yourself with that. We talked about EIDLs a little bit. These are loans that exhausted. They're already done, but our president has at least hinted at in press conferences there's going to be some more funding coming. So get on this if you need it. You're wondering how you're going to bridge the gap for the rest of the year into 2021. Start thinking about these resources that are available for you through the CARES Act and whatever new legislation comes down. FCRA, if you have questions regarding the PSL, COVID-PSL leave, or the FMLA, these will help you. And then also there's the executive orders. So thank you all for joining today. If you want to have some questions, Sarah and Kevin, or read them out, I'm happy to answer them. If I went over anything too fast and you want some more specificity, it was a lot to jam in an hour, so I get that. Please let me know. I'm happy to address it.
Let me unmute myself. Brooke, I thought you did a really good job of covering a lot of information in a short amount of time. That was tremendous. A couple of follow-up questions. So some of the employees, a lot of the tech industry are highly paid employees, but there is a segment of manufacturing where you have assembly workers, and their compensation on unemployment is actually more than they're making, and that seems to be an issue with getting people back to work. And I'm just wondering, are you running? I mean, how? I don't want to say how tough an employer should be, but what's that line where you need to say, you know what, you need to get back into work or get off unemployment? How do you handle those situations?
Absolutely, and I see it every week, multiple times. I had 2 of them yesterday, where clients had employees that fudged the paperwork, we'll say, is an easy way to do it, where they're backdating, misdating, saying their last day of employment was certain things, or they were furloughed just to get the unemployment money. And so that communication is twofold. One, to the employee, please, you have told me you're not coming back to work because of unemployment. That is improper, and we cannot be part of that. That's unemployment insurance fraud. Please report to work give them a date certain, don't make it the next day at 8 a.m., give them a couple days. If you do not report to work on this day, it will be job abandonment. If there are any other issues for keeping you away from work, please let me know immediately. So you're giving them clear opportunity to lay it out there, right? They don't do it, you're in a safe space of reporting them to the EDD. And that's the second communication. You actually need to be proactive. And right now, it's super frustrating because the EDD has shut down all of their local offices. You can't go in there and talk to a deputy or an agent face-to-face because of the pandemic. But they do have a PO box, and they have an online submission form on their website where you can just write a simple letter and let them know what's going on with this particular employee. You have to fill out the SSN number, and that will disqualify them from benefits. Then, as the employer, you have a choice. Do you want to hire this person back or not? I will tell you, I'm a little suspicious of employees that were playing that scam. If they're willing to do it with the state's money, who knows what they're willing to do with your money?
Some of the other issues are around remote workers. So you're asking me to work from, I think these are outliers questions. I think these aren't applicable to a lot of companies, but you're asking me as an employee to work from home. But guess what? I don't have equipment to work at home. I have my own personal laptop, but I don't have a computer. I don't have a chair. I don't have a desk. I need you to give me $500 to buy stuff. What obligations does an employer have to provide the right equipment from working remotely?
It's not a one-size-fit-all answer, but I want to give you kind of some different shades of that. One example is the employee that asked for ergonomic chairs in the workplace already. So when we were back last year working, they said, I've got a spinal issue and I need a standing desk, whatever that may be, and we provided it to them. I think we are under an obligation to explore what we can do for their home office since they're required to work from home. But a simple solution is make them sign an equipment release form that you're going to let them come to work and let them use their office equipment at home. That's an inexpensive way. You can also provide stipends. I mean, look, $500 sounds a little rich to me, but there are stipends that you should provide to your employees if you're asking them to use their cell phone, their internet connection, reams of paper, and then always have the caveat language at the end of your policy in your remote work agreement that says, if you incur a necessary business expense that is not covered by this amount of money we're providing, please immediately talk to and give them a contact. Because then the onus is on the employee to step up and do that. The labor code section is 2802. And what it says, the standard is the employer knew or should have known that they were incurring expenses. So if we put the responsibility on the employee to report it and they don't, I like that defense much better than just, sticking our head in the sand.
Brooke, you have an answer for everything, as we would expect. So going back to the temperature and having people. So I'm an employee and I come in and I don't want you taking my temperature. I want to protect my privacy. I don't think it's right. I don't believe in this. And I'm not going to wear a mask. I think that, I'm watching news reports that say you don't need to wear a mask. And I'm not going to wear a mask and I don't want you to do my temperature check, but I'm here and I'm ready to work.
Yeah, so that's going to be a no-go. You're going to be going home for the day. That is not a reporting time pay issue. So if there's been the question of, well, what if the employee shows up and they want to work, but they fail? Are they really able to work? Do we have to pay them reporting time pay? I think that depends on the industry and what your policy says. But if you have an obstinate employee that's just saying, I don't believe in this, COVID's a scam, I think George Soros created all of this or some other conspiracy theory, yeah, you don't have to.
Now it's Bill Gates, so.
Yeah, Bill Gates. Yeah, Soros, Bill Gates, they all conspired together and they're trying to get us to take Chinese vaccines. We've heard a lot of crazy stuff, and that is not objectively reasonable. Okay, you can have the employee adhere to your policy, or essentially it becomes a disciplinary action, and that starts with performance improvement plans, counseling, or in some cases, if it's egregious enough, it's termination.
Okay, sounds good. I think those are some questions that I've been running into. Again, this is going to be archived. It's going to be on YouTube, and it'll also be made available to the participants. One of the things I really want to thank Brooke and Procopio. Tech San Diego has very few service providers, and we carefully screen them. And Procopio is right at the top of the list. They were a founding member of Tech San Diego. They've continually provided information, especially during the pandemic. They have one of the best resource pages in town. So go to procopio.com. We mirror a lot of their resources on our page, techsd.org. So take a look at those pages. And Brooke, we may need you back in the future. I mean, this is constantly evolving. This is one of the best webinars that I've attended and I've heard of where you've covered such a broad swath of information in a short amount of time.
Well, thank you, Kevin, and thank you, everyone, for being here. And like Kevin said, we're here for you. Certainly, if you need forms or information, reach out. We're happy to help.
All right, Brooke, thanks very much. Now, your contact information is on this last slide?
That's correct. That's my contact information, and we'll circulate a PDF. I'll send it to Sarah, and everyone will have access to this information.
All right, sounds good. All right, thanks, Brooke. Thank you to the participants, and we'll go ahead and close down this webinar.